September 27, 1941. Richmond, California. Dawn. A thin fog rolled in from the San Francisco Bay, brushing against rows of half-finished steel hulls. The scent of burning metal hung heavy in the air. Sparks burst like fireworks from the ribs of a ship that didn't yet have a name. Men and women, some in overalls, some in freshly issued hard hats, moved with a nervous kind of urgency across the dockyard. The air shuddered with the rumble of cranes. It was not a battlefield, but it sounded like one. In the center of this industrial chaos stood a man with a soft-spoken manner and a hard gaze, Henry John Kaiser. He wasn't a naval officer. He wasn't even a trained shipbuilder. Before the war, he had built highways and dams, Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee, projects that redefined the American landscape. But today, staring at the half-completed hull of a Liberty ship, Kaiser was about to do something even more radical. He was going to change the way America fought the war. The Liberty ships were the lifeline of the Allies, cargo carriers that hauled food, ammunition, and hope across U-boat-infested waters. But in 1941, building just one took over 230 days. Too slow. Britain was starving. Convoys were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, and shipyards across the country were choking under the pressure. Kaiser's solution sounded insane. He wanted to build one in 4 days. Even his allies laughed. "You can't mass-produce ships," they told him. "This isn't an automobile factory." Naval engineers muttered that Kaiser didn't understand the complexity, the delicate art of riveting, the painstaking process of laying down a keel. But Kaiser had a secret, something that no one in traditional shipbuilding circles dared to imagine. He wasn't planning to build ships the old way. He was going to assemble them. As the morning mist thinned, Kaiser walked the length of the dry dock, his boots striking the steel plates like a metronome. He stopped beside a young engineer, clipboard in hand. "Every piece," Kaiser said, pointing to a section of the hull, "should fit like a puzzle. Welded, not riveted. Prefabricated, not hammered out here." The engineer frowned. "Sir, that means we'd have to build the shipyards themselves differently. Whole sections built inland, then shipped here." Kaiser smiled faintly. "Exactly. We'll build the factory that builds the ship before we build the ship itself." It was audacious, almost reckless. Traditional shipyards were never designed for such modular work. But Kaiser wasn't bound by tradition. He was an outsider, and outsiders see possibilities where experts see rules. By noon, he had gathered his foremen. Many were new to the trade, former miners, waitresses, farmhands. The war had drawn everyone into the industrial effort. "We're not just building steel boxes," Kaiser told them. "We're building victory one plate at a time." In the distance, a horn sounded. Shift change. Thousands poured through the gates, lunch pails in hand. The Richmond shipyard, once a quiet coastal strip, now pulsed with life 24 hours a day. Welders struck arcs that painted the fog in ghostly blue light. Riveters pounded like artillery. But for all the noise and motion, the skeptics remained. The U.S. Maritime Commission doubted Kaiser's claims. Navy bureaucrats whispered that his welded wonders would crack under the stress of the sea. And perhaps the most cutting remark of all came from a senior naval constructor. "Mr. Kaiser's methods may be suitable for making toasters, not ships." Kaiser heard it all, but he didn't answer with words. He answered with production schedules. By the time the sun dipped below the bay that evening, a dozen new hull sections had been fitted, each welded in place instead of riveted. Sparks flew like comets across the deck. A few yards away, a foreman looked up from his clipboard and blinked in disbelief. "We've never seen a ship go together this fast," he murmured. Kaiser only nodded. "This is just the beginning," he said. Somewhere across the Atlantic, merchant sailors were dying by the hundreds as German torpedoes ripped through convoys. But here, in a foggy California shipyard, the counterattack had begun. Not with guns, but with welders. In the months to come, these yards would become the beating heart of America's industrial miracle. And it all started with a man who refused to accept that impossible meant final. The race to outbuild the ocean's killers had begun. December 1941. Richmond Shipyard No. 2. Midnight, floodlights, carved harsh white columns through the fog. The bay winds cut like knives against the workers' faces. On the dry dock, sparks burst from the steel like tiny stars before falling away into the darkness. The shift whistle had just blown, but nobody was slowing down. Not tonight. Henry Kaiser stood on a raised catwalk overlooking the shipyard that shouldn't have existed, a shipyard he built from scratch in just 9 months. Where marshland and warehouses once stood, 4 massive dry docks now plunged deep into the earth, flanked by assembly sheds that glowed from within like furnaces. He exhaled into the cold air, watching his breath vanish. This was not a shipyard, it was a machine. Kaiser's engineers walked beside him, one carrying blueprints rolled under his arm. Another scribbled numbers on a clipboard as they traversed the catwalk, their boots thudding on steel grating. "We're not laying down keels anymore," Kaiser reminded them. "We're building sections, like the automotive plants, like Ford." Down below, the evidence unfolded. Enormous hull segments, pre-assembled miles away at inland subcontractor factories, arrived on flatbed trucks. Cranes the size of 3-story buildings swung them into place with precision normally reserved for watchmakers. The new welding sheds, clean, covered, brightly lit, housed newly trained welders, many of them women. Rosie the Riveter wasn't a slogan here, she was reality. A young woman in a welder's mask flipped it up and wiped sweat from her forehead. She barely looked 20. Kaiser nodded to her as he descended to the deck. She straightened immediately. "Sir, Mr. Kaiser." "Good evening," he replied warmly. "How many seams today?" 46 feet of hull weld, sir." A note of pride. "Used to take our team 2 days with rivets. Now 2 hours," Kaiser smiled. "Keep going. The Atlantic is waiting." As he walked away, one of his engineers murmured, "Half our workforce has never touched a ship before this year." Kaiser stopped short, turning to face the man. "That's why they'll succeed. No bad habits to unlearn." The engineer swallowed and nodded. Across the yard, the tempo built. Flat cars carrying prefab deckhouses rolled into position. Overhead cranes swung steel plates with surgical precision. Teams welded bow sections while other crews lined the deck with piping and wiring, tasks that traditional shipyards would never dare begin so early. To the old-school shipwrights, this wasn't shipbuilding. To Henry Kaiser, this was war. A foreman jogged up to him breathless. "Sir, the Maritime Commission inspectors are here." Of course they were. Men in crisp coats and hats approached, clipboards tucked under their arms. They moved slowly, suspiciously, scanning weld seams as though searching for reasons to shut the place down. Their expressions said it all. This shouldn't be possible. "Mr. Kaiser," one finally addressed him. "We're concerned about your welding. Rivets have worked for centuries. Welding is new, risky. Fatigue cracks have appeared on several prototype hulls." Kaiser didn't flinch. "You've seen the test results from the Naval Lab," he replied. "Welded seams distribute stress evenly. Rivets create weak points. Welding is stronger and faster." The inspector adjusted his glasses, unimpressed. "You're abandoning centuries of maritime practice. You're putting untrained civilians on critical seams." Kaiser gestured toward a welding tent. Inside, trainers guided men and women through precise, practiced movements. Sparks illuminated determined faces. These untrained civilians learn faster than shipwrights stuck in their ways. And they want to be here. They know what's at stake. The inspector leaned forward. "You think you can conjure ships out of thin air, Mr. Kaiser?" Kaiser stepped toward him, voice low but steady. "I don't conjure, I build. And soon we'll be launching Liberty ships faster than the Germans can sink them." The inspector left with no response. 2 weeks later, rain hammered the shipyard like artillery. Flooded catwalks shimmered beneath the lights, yet hundreds of workers marched through puddles, ignoring the cold, the wind, the miserable night shift. Closer now. Liberty ship hull number 243 rose like a mountain of steel. At Dock 3, the bow section inched forward on greased rails. "All right," the foreman boomed. "Connect her." Chains tightened. Metal screamed. 2 segments, each the size of a house, aligned with a sound like thunder. Welders dropped their masks. Blue arcs roared to life. In the glare of the weld, Kaiser stood, rain soaking into his jacket. He was motionless, watching, absorbing every angle and flame. His chief engineer leaned close, shouting through the storm, "Sir, we just welded an entire bow section in 12 hours. Kaiser didn't answer for a moment. Rain ran down his face, mixing with sweat. "We're not building ships faster," he finally said. "We're building victory sooner." He turned and walked into the storm. Behind him, a torch flared brighter. The first fully welded Liberty ship was no longer an idea. It was becoming inevitable. May 1942, Richmond Shipyard No. 1, 02:15 a.m. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 in the morning. Most of California slept, but not the shipyard. Floodlights drenched the steel skeletons in harsh white, casting long shadows across the wet concrete. Rain blew sideways off the bay, slashing into the workers as they moved from section to section, soaked but unbroken. Tonight everything was different. Tonight, they weren't just trying to build faster. Tonight, they were trying to break the impossible. Henry Kaiser stood beside dry dock No. 2, his coat flapping violently in the wind. Around him, supervisors clutched clipboards and production schedules sealed in plastic. A banner inside the tented staging area read, "Record attempt. Goal, complete in under 4 days." At the bottom of the banner, someone had taped a hand-drawn U-boat with an angry face and the words, "Outbuild this." Kaiser lifted his wrist to check the time. Day 1, hour 00. The first segment rolled into position. Crew Chief Alberto Ruiz pulled off his hard hat to wipe rain from his forehead. "Sir," he said to Kaiser, "dock is ready." All prefab units staged. Kaiser nodded. "Then begin." Ruiz raised a flare gun and fired into the air. Bang! The workers erupted in cheers. They weren't just building a ship, they were fighting the Atlantic. Day 1, hour 08:21. Massive cranes, each marked with stenciled numbers and names, swung the keel plates into place. Welders attacked the seams like surgeons closing incisions. Sparks exploded in every direction. Above the roar of machinery, Kaiser overheard a burly inspector mutter, "This is insanity." His partner shook his head. Ships don't go together like Legos. But they did. Hours later, entire midship sections were lowered onto the growing hull like puzzle pieces. A forklift operator named Helen Thompson, former waitress, now certified welder, guided her machine into position with surgical control. She pressed a radio to her ear, listening to signals from the crane operator. "That's good. That's good. Drop it now." Clang. Perfect alignment. The inspector's jaw dropped. Kaiser allowed himself a tiny private smile. Day 1. Hour 19:07, the ship's skeleton stood complete. Welders moved nonstop, swapping out when their hands shook from fatigue. Supervisors monitored every seam with X-ray cameras, technology that Kaiser insisted on despite protests over cost. "Welding makes a ship stronger," he told them, "but inspection keeps sailors alive." Inside a warming tent, exhausted workers huddled over coffee. A young man named Charlie rolled his shoulders and winced. "My arms feel like I've been wrestling steel bears." Helen smirked. "You were wrestling steel bears," a whistle shrieked. They were back on the deck within 90 seconds. Day 2. Hour 26:54, fog rolled back in and wrapped the ship like a ghost. Deckhouses arrived next, pre-wired and pre-painted, another unheard of step. Instead of installing electrical and plumbing after the hull was complete, Kaiser had ordered everything built in modules. "Why wait," he'd said, "when we can build everything at once?" Ruiz blew his whistle again. Up, up, up. Crane cables tightened. The deckhouse rose, slowly, steadily, until it hovered over the hull. A crane operator named Big Tom eased the controls. The building slid into place as gently as a feather. Thunder cracked overhead. From the catwalk, Kaiser whispered, "You see that? We are rewriting shipbuilding." His assistant, drenched and shivering, scribbled notes on a clipboard. "Sir, we're ahead of schedule." Ahead? That word had never belonged in shipyards before Henry Kaiser. Day 3. Hour 52. 3 days ago, this vessel had been piles of steel and sections waiting on flat cars. Now welders sealed the final seams. Painters rushed along scaffolding, brushes flying. Workers hauled the gangway off the deck. All that remained was the engine test. Steam hissed. The Liberty ship's engine coughed once, then roared to life. The workers exploded in cheers. A riveter, older than most, hair streaked with silver, sniffed and wiped his eyes. "I've been in yards 30 years, he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like this." Day 4, hour 96:03, a brass band assembled at the dock. Families and reporters gathered under umbrellas. American flags whipped in the gale. Kaiser stood at the podium wearing a fresh coat, his hair tamed by pomade. But nothing could hide the exhaustion in his eyes. A reporter leaned toward him. "Mr. Kaiser, is it true? 4 days?" Kaiser didn't look at the reporter. He looked at the ship. The enormous Liberty ship towered above the harbor, its newly painted name shining under the gray sky. SS. Robert E. Peary Kaiser spoke quietly, but every microphone caught it. "We don't win this war by fighting harder," he said. "We win by building faster." The christening. Bottle smashed against the bow. The ship slid into the water to thunderous applause. 4 days. Not 34 merchant sailors in the crowd watched with tears in their eyes. One whispered, "We might just beat the U-boats." From the stage, Henry Kaiser didn't cheer. He only murmured, "Faster still," because in his mind, the next ship had already begun. November 1942, North Atlantic night wind tore across the deck. Salt spray stung the eyes of the sailors on watch. Beneath their boots, the hull of the SS Robert E. Peary rose and fell with the restless heave of the Atlantic. The ship was only months old, freshly painted, welded together in 4 days. A miracle of industry. But out here, miracles meant nothing. Here, only survival mattered. A convoy stretched across the sea. Tankers, freighters, and Liberty ships, escorted by destroyers running dark. The moonlight died behind sheets of fog. Engines throbbed deep in their hulls, steady, continuous. A heartbeat fighting against the ocean. Inside the Peary's wheelhouse, Captain William Harkness, a merchant mariner with flecks of gray in his beard, tightened his grip on the wheel. "Convoy speed. 9 knots, called the helmsman. "Maintain course," Harkness replied, voice low, eyes sharp. "U-boats love nights like this." A young sailor, barely 20, scanned the waves through binoculars. His hands trembled. They all knew what lurked beneath the surface. German wolf packs hunting silently. Harkness paced to the chart table. He paused as his gaze fell on the metal plate mounted near the compass, installed before her launch. Built by Kaiser Shipyards, Richmond. California, built in 4 days. The captain traced the letters with his fingertips. It seemed impossible that something built so quickly could withstand combat. But here they were, messaging the world that America could outbuild fear. A distant sound cracked across the water. Boom. The deck shuddered under their feet. Explosion. Bearing 085. Shouted the lookout. Through the fog, a fireball illuminated the night. Another ship in the convoy had been hit. U-boat torpedo. Harkness growled, "Sound general quarters." Claxons screamed through the ship. Men scrambled down the passageways, boots hammering metal floors. The Peary's 20mm Oerlikon gunners raced to their stations, slamming magazines into place. You could taste the adrenaline in the air. You could smell the fear. "Signal from the destroyer," barked the radio operator. "Wolfpack, multiple contacts closing fast." Harkness turned to his helmsman. "We stay in column. Don't break formation. Kaiser gave us speed. We use it." The Peary surged forward, engine pounding as the convoy zigzagged through the dark water. Back in California, Kaiser couldn't sleep. Across the oceans, his ships were proving whether bold ideas and welded seams could save lives. He paced the steel platform above Richmond Shipyard No. 3, watching the night shift work. Welders leaned into their torches. Cranes swung steel modules into place like clockwork. "We have new reports from the Atlantic," said production manager Lenny Foster, handing Kaiser a telegram. "A convoy was hit. Liberty ship damage. Uncertain." Kaiser unfolded the message with steady hands. "Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary remains afloat, withstood blast pressure. No structural failure." He exhaled shakily. Around him, the relentless clatter of the yard seemed to fade. His ship, their ship, had taken a torpedo shock and held, not riveted. Welded, stronger. Foster looked at him. "You did it, Henry." Kaiser shook his head slowly. "We did it. Back on the Atlantic." 2:26 a.m. The fog had thinned, and moonlight carved silver streaks across the waves. Harkness stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes. "Destroyer to port," yelled a sailor. "She's dropping depth charges." Boom, 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 columns of water towered into the air. The force rocked the Peary port side. "Brace!" Harkness shouted. The ship rolled, then steadied. Harkness gripped the railing, heart pounding. He could feel the welded hull vibrating beneath his feet as the Peary powered forward. No groans of overstressed rivets. No popping seams, just strength. "We're holding," whispered a sailor. "She's really holding." Minutes stretched like hours. Men waited, breath frozen in their lungs. Then, a plume of oil and debris erupted from the ocean. Cheers burst across the deck. "They got the U-boat." Harkness lowered his binoculars. His voice cracked with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this ship was built in 4 days." One sailor clapped a hand on the hull, and she built to last. The Peary didn't just survive the convoy. She led it through. Because of Kaiser's welds. Because of the experiment no one believed in. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., typed reports from the Atlantic arrived on the desk of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Kaiser ships proving superior request expansion of modular weld program. Roosevelt leaned back in his chair. "Get this message to Kaiser," he said. "Tell him America needs more." Across the country, young welders and builders read the headlines. They saw ships they built heading into danger and returning. Pride replaced doubt. Workers labored harder, faster, with new urgency. These weren't ships anymore. They were lifelines. Kaiser stood on the catwalk at Richmond again, watching sparks rain from a new Liberty ship hull. This one would be done in under 5 days. A foreman jogged up to him. "Shipyard wants to name her after you, sir." Kaiser shook his head. "No, name her for a sailor. Someone who sails what we build." His eyes stayed fixed on the blazing arc of welding torches. "We're not the heroes. They are." The Peary cut through the Atlantic strong. Defiant, welded seams holding firm against the brutal sea. And somewhere deep inside Henry Kaiser's mind, a new idea had already taken root. Faster, bigger, stronger. If Liberty ships could be built like this, then what about warships? Aircraft carriers? The stakes were about to rise. March 1943, Richmond Shipyard No. 3. Afternoon rainwater pooled on the steel walkway as Henry Kaiser stared down at the newest dry dock. The roar of machinery swallowed every other sound. Cranes swung overhead like mechanical giants. Welders knelt inside open hulls, torches erupting in bursts of brilliant blue flame that lit their faces like lightning. Kaiser's coat snapped in the wind. He wasn't shivering from the cold. He was staring at something no one on Earth had ever seen before. 4 dry docks, 32 assembly bays, welders working on 16 ships at once. Other yards built 1 ship at a time. Kaiser built a fleet. Beside him stood Vice Admiral Emory Land, head of the U.S. Maritime Commission, the man who had doubted Kaiser more than anyone. His uniform coat was immaculate, his posture rigid. His eyes, however, reflected shock. He watched workers guide an entire stern section of a Liberty ship into place with casual precision. "Kaiser," Land said slowly, "I don't understand how your people do this." Kaiser kept his eyes on the hull. "They don't build ships," he said. "They build sections. Then we bring them together." A massive crane lifted a pre-assembled deckhouse, painted, wired, outfitted with bunks, into the air and swung it toward the waiting hull like a child lowering a toy into a sandbox. "That's 300 tons, Land muttered. "How in God's name?" Kaiser turned to look at him fully for the first time. His voice was soft. "You don't fight a war with caution, Admiral. You fight it with courage." Workers below them cheered as the deckhouse locked into place with a thunderous clang. Land cleared his throat. "I heard the Peary survived a torpedo blast." "It did," Kaiser replied. "It led the convoy out." Land's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with realization. "Kaiser." He drew in a breath. "You've changed shipbuilding forever." The pace accelerated. Welders rotated in teams, 8 hours on, 4 hours off, then back to the line. They slept in converted barracks, ate in massive mess halls, and lived to build. Many were women. Many were older than draft age. Some workers were missing fingers from farm accidents. Some were college girls who'd never touched a tool before this year. All of them were shipbuilders now. Inside the fabrication sheds, giant steel presses slammed into plate after plate. Kathunk, 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 each strike shaping a piece that would slot into a hull miles away. Conveyor lines rattled like assembly lines in Detroit. Kaisers, supervisors no longer talked in days, they talked in hours, midship sections, complete 22 hours ahead, stern, welded and tested, moved to dock, bulkheads, Past X-ray, ready for fitment. If a module failed, Kaiser didn't blame the workers, he blamed the process. Fix the process, he said, never the people. But the miracle came at a cost. One night, Chief Engineer Lenny Foster found Kaiser slumped over a drafting table, shirt still buttoned, tie crooked. Empty coffee cups littered the floor. "Henry," Foster said quietly, "when's the last time you slept?" "Sleep doesn't build ships," Kaiser replied without looking up. "Steel builds ships. And who builds steel?" Foster asked. Kaiser finally met his eyes. In that moment, Foster saw the truth. The burden Kaiser carried, the weight of every sinking ship, every lost convoy, every name on a casualty list. "We're building hope," Kaiser whispered. "Hope doesn't get to rest." He stood, took his coat, and headed for the yard. Richmond wasn't just building ships. Richmond became a city. People poured in from every state. Okies from the Dust Bowl, machinists from Pennsylvania, single mothers from Chicago, ranch hands from New Mexico. They came with nothing but backpacks and desperation, some with children, and Kaiser turned no one away. No other shipyard would hire them. But Kaiser created something unheard of during Abu II. A 24-hour on-site daycare system, free medical clinics, affordable housing near the yard. When workers got sick, they didn't quit. They went to the Kaiser Permanente medical plan, a healthcare system born in the shipyards that still exists today. "We're not just building ships," Kaiser told a reporter. "We're building builders." August 11, 1943. The launch pier. Kaiser stood beside Admiral Land and a crowd of reporters. A massive Liberty ship, hull number 1252, sat ready for launch. Welders lined the rails, boots still dirty from the morning shift, faces smudged with soot. Land leaned closer. "How long?" Kaiser checked his watch. 4 days, 15 hours, he said, including engine install. Reporters gasped, workers erupted into cheers. Land stared. "Speechless, Henry," he finally whispered. "You've made shipyards obsolete." "No," Kaiser corrected gently. "I made them faster." The champagne bottle smashed against the bow. The ship thundered down the greased ways and slammed into the bay, sending a wave over everyone on the pier. Someone shouted, "Another one starting in Dock 2." Kaiser turned, and there it was. Workers already lowering the first prefab keel into a new dry dock. He smiled. "We don't stop," he said. Across the world, Liberty ships steamed toward Europe with tanks, fuel, and ammunition. U-boats could sink a convoy. They could not sink a production system. The ocean had become a numbers game, and Henry Kaiser changed the numbers. May 7, 1945, Boston Harbor. Morning. A thick fog curled around the docks as gulls screeched overhead. The Liberty ship SS John W. Brown eased into port, her hull streaked with rust, her deck scarred from North Atlantic storms and escort duty. Lines were thrown, winches groaned, and sailors, bone-tired, silent, stepped onto American soil. They had been gone for months, some for years. A crowd waved flags and hand-painted signs. Mothers pushed forward. Children broke into sprints. A man shouted the name of his brother over and over, voice cracking with hope. From the deck, a boatswain cupped his hands and yelled down, "What's the commotion?" A dock worker, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, answered, "It's over. Germany surrendered." Sailors froze. For a second, no one breathed. Then, chaos, cheering, laughing, crying. Men who had faced U-boats in black water, who had counted seconds between torpedoes and death, collapsed into the arms of their families. The war in Europe was finished, and in that moment, across the ocean and across the years, a quiet victory belonged to one man who never fired a gun. Henry Kaiser wasn't at the dock that day. He stood instead on the steel catwalk of Richmond Shipyard No. 3, now quiet, eerily still. The cranes, once swinging 15-hour shifts, stood motionless like sleeping giants. The welding sheds were empty. Dry docks echoed where once they had thundered. He rested his hands on the railing, staring at the place that had consumed him. The shipyard had become a cathedral of silence. Kaiser's son, Edgar, stood beside him. The younger man wore a clean shirt and tie, very unlike the nights they'd spent here wearing grease and rain. "You should be there," Edgar said, "in Boston, watching them come home." Kaiser shook his head. Let the heroes celebrate. This, he nodded toward the empty docks, is where we fought. The wind rustled loose papers across the concrete like dry leaves. Edgar looked at the yard that 2 years earlier had roared like a living thing. At its peak, 90,000 workers moved through it every 24 hours. Welders, electricians, cooks, doctors, single mothers, elderly machinists, teenagers with forged birth certificates who just wanted to help. You built more than ships, Edgar said. Kaiser didn't answer. He remembered. Night shifts in driving rain. Fresh welders with shaking hands, coffee gone cold at drafting tables, telegram after telegram on his desk. Convoy arrived safely. Ship performed well. He remembered standing in Washington, months earlier opposite President Roosevelt. Roosevelt leaned on his desk, cigarette holder angled between his fingers. You proved them wrong, Henry. The Navy said welding would fail. The commission said civilians couldn't build ships. But you delivered. Kaiser had answered with numbers because numbers never brag. Before the war, 230 days to build a ship. Under Kaiser, 4 days, 15 hours, 26 minutes. Roosevelt tapped ash into a tray. You didn't just build ships, he said. You built the sword we carried into the Atlantic. A sudden rumble shook Kaiser back to the present. Edgar turned. Down at Dry Dock 1, a group of workers, those who hadn't yet gone home, had gathered spontaneously. Someone had rolled out a half-used spool of welding cable. A few others held lunch pails filled with screws and small tools as makeshift noisemakers. A crane operator climbed into his cab and tapped the horn. Once, then again. The deep bellow echoed across the yard. Welders, pipe fitters, foremen, men and women who had never met before the war, stood shoulder to shoulder. One began to chant. We built the ships. Another picked it up. That beat the wolves. Then all of them. Fists in the air. We built the ships that won the war. The sound rolled across the empty dry docks and slammed into Kaiser like a wave. His throat tightened. He gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened. They weren't chanting his name, they were chanting their work, their effort, their victory. Later that afternoon, as workers dispersed and the sun lowered over the bay, Edgar asked quietly, "What will you do now?" Henry Kaiser turned toward the empty yards, where the sparks no longer flew, where the night no longer shook with the sound of welding torches, and he exhaled. "Build again," he said. "Build what?" Edgar asked. Kaiser's eyes softened. "Hospitals, care, health without bankrupting workers," and he did. The medical clinics he built for welders became the foundation of Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare systems in America. He didn't stop there. He built cars. He built infrastructure. He built communities. Because Henry Kaiser never built things, he built possibilities. Epilogue. The legacy of the impossible, more than 2,700 Liberty. Ships were built during W2, most of them at Kaiser's yards. Historians still say the Liberty ship won the war, not because it was glamorous, not because it was beautiful, but because it existed. Because every 4 days, another one slid into the water. Because every 4 days, a convoy had one more lifeline. Because one civilian refused to accept the word impossible. He took a ship that required 230 days and turned it into 4. Henry Kaiser never commanded troops, never fired artillery, never rode into battle. But every Liberty ship that made it across the Atlantic was a bullet fired at tyranny, a bullet shaped like a cargo hull, welded by civilians, guided by belief, and that might be the greatest victory of all.